So many years ago when I was a boy, there was a photo in my family of a man with dark skin and a big bushy beard, and I knew that he was my great-great-grandfather, and I knew his name was George Brydon Brandon, and the story was in the family then that he was from Jamaica, but I didn't really think much about it. I was a kid, I had other interests, and I probably didn't pick up on George's story again until my father passed away in 2009. We had a big job cleaning out all his art studios, and I found a dusty old folder there. I started flicking through it and realised that it was the story of my family.
I was delighted when Garry Chapman, a retired history teacher, got in touch with me after he'd read my novel Master of My Fate, the true story of William Buchanan, a Jamaican slave who was transported to colonial New South Wales in 1836. He wanted to know more about Caribbean people and what their lives might have been like before arriving in Australia. As we continued to email back and forth, I realised that there were all kinds of resonances with the other stories that we've been collecting in this series. So I travelled down to Melbourne with my co-producer, Ben Etherington, to discover more. Ben and I have actually arrived in Greensboro. It's about 30 minutes outside of Melbourne proper.
Okay, let's go up and say hello to Garry.
Oh, my Lord.
Hello, Sienna. Welcome.
Garry.
So nice to meet you.
I know. So nice to meet you too.
Yeah.
Cheers, Garry.
G'day, Ben.
Thanks for having us over. Oh, beautiful place.
Yeah.
Mine's back this way.
So we can sit in here or we can sit at the table in here.
Yeah,
Yeah,
lovely.
well, it will take us a little while.
Welcome to the 4th episode of Caribbean Echoes, a History Lab series that delves into the lives of Caribbean Australians. In the last episode, we pieced together the story of how Nellie Small's ancestors arrived in the 1850s. Garry Chapman's ancestors also arrived at that time. Today, we hear Garry give an intimate account of how Caribbean men, and especially women, established themselves in colonial society during the gold rushes.
I think it's really quite remarkable. John Brandon, the grandson of a Jamaican housekeeper, has become one of the founding key players in the growth of the Australian mining industry.
We also look into the experiences of his family in Jamaica before they set sail. To help us piece together that part of the story, we sit down later with Jamaican historian Suzanne Francis Brown. She's an expert in turning bureaucratic records into lived historical experiences and is regularly featured on the BBC's Who Do You Think You Are?
Let me tell you, it's not an uncommon situation. Okay, people who had been enslaved and who are free in some circumstances end up owning slaves themselves. It's a mind-blowing thing, and it's a mind shifter to try and move from the headspace of that time to the headspace of today.
A quick warning, this episode involves discussion of the traumatic experiences of enslaved people, whose legacies are still felt today. Our conversation with Garry begins in his living room in suburban Melbourne, surrounded by furniture, books, a massive CDs and memorabilia of the Richmond Footy Club. And so, Garry, what did you discover about the man with the dark skin and the big bushy beard?
George Brydon Brandon is my great-great-grandfather. He was born in Kingston, Jamaica, to Moses Brandon, a Jewish merchant, and his housekeeper, Susannah Andrews. I know she never married Moses Brandon, but she lived with him, had 4 children by him, and he passed away in 1835 and left her property in his will. And he was quite a wealthy man, I believe. He had multiple pieces of real estate, and he'd left them to her and to her children. But George was baptised into the Christian religion. He practised as a merchant in Kingston for the first 29 years of his life. And in 1853, with his first wife and his mother and a son, they emigrated to Gold Rush, Melbourne.
And do you know how they travelled from Jamaica to Australia?
They left on a ship called the Baltimore out of New York, so I'm not quite sure how they got from Kingston to New York.
That would have been a big deal to leave the tropics and then arrive in Melbourne, Australia
Absolutely.
in 1853.
Yeah, I often wonder about people who came to Melbourne during the gold rush, if they came sort of sight unseen, knowing nothing and having nothing organised, or if they had agents here who were lining up opportunities for them when they got here. But I do know this, that from the time they got on that boat, Susannah was no longer known as Susannah Andrews. She named herself Mrs. Susan Brandon.
Garry, that sounds like there's a mystery to be unravelled there. I'm curious, though, how did she and her family fare when they arrived in Melbourne?
They struggled a bit, but she was listed as a storekeeper, and so she was clearly working in Brandon's store for quite some time. George remarried, and they had their first child, Amy. And for the first 4 years of Amy's life, Susannah was in the home, clearly helping to raise the child. Probably was cooking in the kitchen with her and looking at the objects that had been brought across from Jamaica and heard the stories, and she would have heard the accent, and Susannah would have been passing on some of the culture that was her heritage.
Garry, before we continue with her story, can you tell us how her children fared in this new country?
The first one, I suppose, is George himself, who he'd only been in the colony about a year before he was caught up in a court action over a lot of money he was owed, £225, which would have been a fortune.
Okay.
So it might have been a bad business deal back in Jamaica, I just don't know. But that would have made it a difficult start in the new land.
Absolutely.
If you thought you had money behind you and when you got here, the money was missing.
Was missing. And where were they living at that point? I mean, where were they in Melbourne?
So the first address I found it in Richmond. Some of the factories that were established in Richmond were tanneries, and they lived in Tanner Street. So it wouldn't have been a very savoury sort of a place to live, I can imagine. And Richmond for a long time was known as Struggle Town. It's different if you're there today, but yes.
He would have had to have started all over again, which is a real migrant story and certainly one of my own. I certainly have experienced that when I first arrived here.
Yeah, well, after a little bit of hardship, George reinvented himself as a school teacher, opened his first school in 1862 in Fitzroy. It was a private academy, and for the next 25 odd years, he ran his school and developed a reputation in early Melbourne. Yeah, as a schoolmaster of great repute. In fact, 40 years later, people were still writing letters to the editor of the Age newspaper, remembering him as a man who had a great influence on their lives.
How about George's children, who, although they had Caribbean roots, were born in Australia? Can you tell us about them?
Yes, all right. So George's eldest daughter, Amy, grew up to be a school teacher herself. Amy and her husband, Charles, lived in Fitzroy as well, very close to George, and she became a teacher. She taught at the school that George had established. She took over the running of that school when he died. She had 5 children in the next 8 years, but she also began to advertise private tuition. But she wasn't advertising for boys and girls. She was advertising for girls and women. And I find that really interesting. The very first time she placed an ad was in 1890, and she continued to teach girls and women penmanship and writing right through till 1907. So for almost 20 years, she was a teacher of literacy to women and girls at a time when a lot of girls and women didn't have those education opportunities.
Gee, Garry, you come from teachers and educators, and you've become a teacher yourself. And what a story about Amy, who was able to uplift girls and women while raising 5 children of her own. Can you tell me a little bit about them? I mean,
Well,
how they got on in their lives?
the youngest of those was her son, Victor Thorpe, or Vic Thorpe as he is commonly known. And he became one of the legendary footballers in the AFL.
Really?
Yeah.
Tell us about Vic.
In 1910, Vic Thorpe went down to Richmond Football Club, which was a Victorian Football League club at the time. It's still a major footy club in the AFL today. He won their best and fairest medal twice. Twice he was named champion of the colony as the best footballer in Victoria before the Brownlow medal was introduced. He was an inaugural member of the AFL Hall of Fame, and just recently he was named an immortal of Richmond Football Club, and there's only 6 people there.
And do you think the crowd would have known he had Caribbean ancestry?
For many, many years, Vic Thorpe was thought to be the first Indigenous footballer because of the colour of his skin. I was contacted only 2 years ago by a researcher writing a book on Indigenous Australian footballers. The researcher asked me if there was Indigenous blood in the family, and I was able to say no. Vic Thorpe actually came from a Caribbean background. He also obviously had a lot of rhythm. They say he was a great dancer, and often at all the social functions, he was the one who held the dance floor and everybody stood back to watch. And people still talk about Vic Thorpe today. He was Caribbean
Aussie, through and through. Really.
Caribbean Aussie, through and through.
So tell us a little bit about some of the other people.
Or Amy's brother, John Brandon. He was a founding company secretary and legal manager for BHP and was in that role for 45 years. He used to keep ore samples from all of the mines in his offices in Melbourne, and potential investors would visit to inspect the ore samples and then invest in the companies. He was paying out unbelievably high dividends to these people who were funding the growth of Australia's mining industries right around the country. I think it's really quite remarkable. John Brandon, the grandson of a Jamaican housekeeper, has become one of the founding key players in the growth of the Australian mining industry. It almost defies belief to think that in just 2 generations this could happen.
There is an old lady here with the blackest skin and the whitest teeth, of whom it's told that years ago in Jamaica she was the connubial partner of one who had wealth at command, and whose mansion was dignified with no less of a title than Marble Hall. If the story be true, she has seen many changes in her time. The Benevolent Asylum. The Argus, October 16, 1863.
Garry, when I was doing some research into Susannah, I was fascinated because I came across an article about her being in the Benevolent Asylum. How did she end up there?
Susannah, unfortunately, in 1862, was charged with lunacy, and she was put into the immigrants' home, a home for people who were fearful in a new country. And the descriptions I've read about the immigrants' home is it was fairly similar to an English workhouse in Victorian times. All I know of Susannah's life from that point on is every time she was transferred to a new institution, there are records that go with her. So it seems that Susannah had dementia. She was moved to the Yarra Bend Lunatic Asylum. The doctors would say that she's in good health, but her mind has gone occasionally. Other than that, her health was fairly stable until 1875 when she had a stroke and died. She's buried in Melbourne General Cemetery with her son.
You know, Garry, it sounds like leaving Kingston, travelling halfway around the world, cost Susannah dearly. Perhaps in the end it all caught up with her. Have you found out much about her life in Jamaica?
So when I was searching for documents on the Ancestry website, there were slave registers there, and I didn't really understand them. But the very first one I found was from 1817, and it listed Susannah Andrews as a slave. And
was that a bit of a shock?
well, it was a massive shock. most of the people in my family history that I've been finding documents for were English or Scottish, but all of a sudden I was looking at a person who'd been born into slavery. And I mean, I believe slavery is such an evil thing, and it's pretty clear that, my third great-grandmother was brought up this way. So, very shocking. And I immediately thought or wondered, and I still wonder to this day, how was she treated? Which is probably what brought me into contact with you, Sienna, because I started Googling the conditions under which slaves lived in Kingston. And I found your book and I read it. I learned a little bit about household slaves. I sort of became aware that George was a merchant in Kingston and he had a slave housekeeper.
Talking to Garry made me realise that he'd reached the same place I'd reached when I first encountered a slave register. In my case, I was trying to reconstruct the life of William Buchanan and his family. I spent months staring at endless lists of enslaved people, trying to fathom their lives. Back then, I got in touch with Suzanne Francis Brown, a writer and historian in Jamaica, and she helped me to understand those dehumanizing documents. I got in touch again to see if she could help with Garry, and she generously agreed to sift through the archival records of Susannah Andrews. We all got together to discuss what she discovered. Suzanne, are you there?
I am. Live and direct.
Hi, Suzanne.
Hi, Garry. It's nice to meet you.
It's really nice to meet you.
I hear you have a lot of questions.
I've got a few, yes. Well, I would preface by saying I know a bit about Susannah's life once she came to Australia, but I also know she was born a slave. Can you tell me what her early life may have been like?
Yeah, so Susannah was enslaved in an urban setting as opposed to the kind of plantation setting that we probably are most familiar with.
Yeah.
And I think that would have been really one of the important things about the way in which her life would have been structured. She wouldn't have been in the field or in the great house in the way that so many of those movies and so on show.
Okay.
She was in a household. It seems like from the size of the property, it appears as if it was probably quite a large and busy household. It's in Port Royal, which is a small and very dense environment. Not as busy as it was before the earthquake of 1692, when it's known as the wickedest city on earth, but still a pretty busy trading town on or very close to the water. We don't know what her owner did. She was a Mrs. Pierce. So Susannah and her daughters are living in this establishment. It's an establishment. It's not a plantation. I think Mrs. Pierce had maybe a couple of dozen people who were enslaved in her household. And that's where Susannah is until 1821.
Suzanne, before we go any further, it'd be great if we could explain where all this information about Susannah is coming from.
Around the time Susannah first comes into the records, these are what were called returns of enslaved people that were required by the government first in 1817, right across the island. So there was a kind of island-wide census that was taken of all enslaved people on plantations, in towns. It didn't matter. The persons who had them enslaved had to make these returns to the government of who was on their property.
Yes, yes.
And the other thing that those records told us was the names of women who had children. And that was really because the only thing they were concerned about was the status of the mother. If the mother was enslaved, the children were slaves. It didn't make any difference whether their fathers were free or not. Whether their fathers were white or black, it didn't make any difference. What mattered was the status of the mother. So in the case of Susannah in 1817, it shows that she was then 31 years old and she had 3 children. She would have been around 15 when her first daughter is born.
Oh, 15.
Which would not be unusual.
Wow.
Would not be unusual at all. Horrible though that may seem to you now. So there's a man called John Hewitt who appears to be the father of the two daughters, who has paid for the manumission of Susannah and her two younger daughters. The eldest daughter stays in slavery with her children. Sometimes the word is manumized, sometimes it's manumitted.
Yes.
But it basically means that the person has been freed on the basis of a payment that says that it is for the value of the person.
Susannah, I was just wondering why Susannah may have been manumitted. Like, what would make a slave owner suddenly free a person?
It's an interesting question, and there are a number of reasons why it happens. It often happened in their wills. So they didn't want to manumit them while it was inconvenient. So they waited until they died and said, okay, this person or that person has been very good and has been loyal and so on. And so I'm leaving money in my will to pay for their freedom, right? And sometimes people who were manumitted in wills did not actually get manumitted because the person who was the main heir might have not wanted to give up their property.
Sorry, would that mean that Susannah's status in Jamaican society changed?
Yes, she moved
Right.
from enslaved to free.
Yeah.
So in the 1820 record, she is a slave to Mrs. Pierce, Mrs. Eliza Pierce of Port Royal. And in the 1823 record, she is listed as having been manumized. And in the manumission record, which is a separate set of documents, it states that Susannah Andrews and her two daughters, the two Hewitt girls, were manumitted in December of 1821.
Yeah.
So she goes from being enslaved to being a free agent.
I'm really pleased to know that someone valued her to make her free.
Bear in mind, she didn't belong to John Hewitt. He lived also in Port Royal. He had some level of a relationship with Susannah, as he must have done.
Yeah.
And he's obviously a white man because her daughters are mulatto. So I don't know if you have come to terms with that particular configuration, but color was a very important thing in Jamaican society in terms of how people were described. And so Susannah is described as a Negro woman. She's black. If you have two parents, one white, one black, you are described as mulatto, or kind of half and half mixed race. And then if a woman who is described as mulatto has children with a white man, the children are described as quadroon. And it kind of goes up the scale until you get to nearly white. So John Hewitt, perhaps he had a relationship with Susannah over a number of years. And he wants perhaps to free his children and perhaps to free his children's mother. One of the things I find interesting, I have to tell you, is Susannah is freed according to the records in December of 1821. Marianne Winter Brandon, who is said to be her first daughter with Moses Brandon, is born in 1820. I'm not really quite sure how that works.
I'm a bit confused too, Suzanne. I mean, what you want to unpack that a little bit for us?
Well, basically, Susannah is not a free agent, one presumes, until she is manumized or manumitted. And the manumission document states that she is manumitted at the end of 1821. But if Marianne is indeed her daughter...
I think it sounds like she was in bed with several men.
Well, not at the same time.
Not at the same time.
Her daughters with John Hewitt are 8 and 9 in 1817.
Yeah.
Right.
So by the time 1821 comes along, they're teenagers, right? So whatever relationship she had with Hewitt is presumably a thing of the past, and he perhaps is paying his debts by getting involved in her manumission. If Marianne is in fact the first child of Susannah and Moses, then obviously Susannah and Moses know each other and are in some sort of relationship from 1819. So perhaps it is that Mrs. Pierce has hired Susannah in some kind of housekeeping capacity to Moses Brandon. That's not unknown. People were hired out for one thing or another. I don't know the answer to that question. It's one of those flies in the ointment, which, complexity makes everything more interesting.
I wondered what the relationship between Moses and Susannah was like. Would it have been a loving relationship? Would they have seen themselves as a family unit? Or was it always like a master and an employee relationship?
I think slavery, it took many forms. I mean, there's the legal form and then there's a human form. But I'm not sure I would use the word employee, because when Susannah was enslaved, she wouldn't have had a choice in the matter. She couldn't have chosen to leave. And I think that's the difference. But in terms of their relationship, it's an interesting one. First of all, there's lots of examples of relationships between mostly white men who had come to, own land and make money in Jamaica, and women who were enslaved. If you have an owner who says, come,
yeah,
you don't really have a lot of choice. But it's not my impression that is this relationship. And for whatever reason, it largely comes about when Susannah is free.
I still had questions about whether Susannah may have been a bit different, because I did know that she was a housekeeper.
The word housekeeper is an interesting one in our context. So there are a lot of housekeepers who are sexual partners. Whether or not they actually are the housekeeper is not always clear. In some large situations, she's not necessarily running the house. And I can give you an example that's very famous, which would be Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, who was his partner, and in many ways in a Jamaican context would probably have been described as his housekeeper. Now, it would be very unusual for them to marry, but for him to have a black woman as his housekeeper and the person whom he trusts and the person whom perhaps receives visitors for him would suggest a positive relationship. Let me put it like that.
I'm really pleased to hear that. That makes me feel good about him. Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yes, because he's actually your great-grandfather.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been focusing on Susannah, but really the Moses Brandon side is also part of your family as well, too. So
Moses comes out of an interesting group in Jamaica. The earliest Jews in Jamaica were of the Sephardic tradition. They came out of Portugal and Spain and eventually out of Brazil. Very much later, there was an Ashkenazi Jewish connection that came down from Northern Europe. There actually were synagogues pretty much in major towns in Jamaica, certainly from the 17th century. So the Jewish population in Jamaica was pretty strong. It was not huge, but quite important because there was persecution in so many places. But in Jamaica, the Jewish population could pretty much always outwardly profess their faith. However, like people of color, there were restrictions on certain activities. So they couldn't hold public office until the 1830s, just like people of color couldn't hold public office. And I think the Jewish community was quite taken aback at the fact that there was moves to improve some of the conditions of the free-colored community, if you like, around the time leading up to emancipation or to the abolition of slavery. And so they redoubled their effort to have the British make changes to their own civil rights. And so they were actually changed around the same time in the early part of the 1830s. So there would have been a sort of rich community of which Moses and his parents, his father Abraham, his mother Judith, were part. I doubt that he was very orthodox, but he certainly would have gone to synagogue. And obviously he did not take his family to synagogue. The children were baptized in the Anglican church, which was the established church. And in fact, that's how we find a lot of these records before civil registration comes in later in the 1800s.
That's one of the things that really has confused me as to why a man, as a member of the Jewish community, would have agreed to have his children baptized in the Christian religion. I would have thought if it was a strong sort of insular community, there would have been an expectation that he raised his children that way.
Not if they were black.
Ah, okay.
Not if they were of color. Right. And bear something in mind also, Garry. In the Jewish tradition, the line carries through the mother, right? Susannah was not Jewish. Susannah would never have been accepted as Jewish. Obviously, there is a cultural and ethnic connection through Moses, but in terms of carrying on a Jewish line, his children wouldn't have been considered Jewish, I don't think.
I understand a lot about how people could become wealthy through the sugar industry, but Moses remained in Kingston as a merchant. Mm-hmm. What was the sort of trade he would have carried on?
So remember, Kingston is a port city. And anything that you can think of that would have been required to run industry would have been imported because there was very little manufacture beyond sugar. So, clothes for people to wear, fabric for people to make clothes from, needles for them to sew, thread for them to sew, food, the food that they gave to the persons who were enslaved, which was largely things like saltfish and mackerel. There's the sale of people. And there were a lot of people. The Brandons don't appear to have been among them, but there were many others, including Jewish families, who were slave factors. That was their business. So there were a lot of merchants, and they had houses close to the port in order to keep an eye on business.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I'm still a little gobsmacked that she inherited so much, and she went from being born a slave to a wealthy property owner, and how her life would have changed because of that.
I think there are some things that change, and there are some things that don't change as much as you might think they would. You're asking about what does it change for her?
Yes.
So it changes her not having to worry about what's going to happen to her in the future. She can do things that she wants. She isn't going to get recognized by high society. Susannah is a black woman. She has been enslaved. Okay, she's now free.
Yeah.
She has children of color, and Jamaica is changing. Slavery is coming to an end. By the time Moses Brandon dies, slavery has been abolished. Emancipation is not yet there because emancipation comes in 1838. But, in a sense, that doesn't matter for Susannah and her children, though it obviously matters for the other persons enslaved in the household. They still have people enslaved in the household, though not a large number. But the fact of slavery remains present. And undoubtedly, Susannah is very cognizant of the fact that that is no longer her life.
Okay, I was wondering how she would feel having slaves in the house.
Let me tell you, it's not an uncommon situation, okay? People who had been enslaved and who are free in some circumstances end up owning slaves themselves.
Wow.
Slavery is a system, okay?
Yep.
And that is how people show that they are wealthy. That is how they invest. It's a mind-blowing thing, and it's a mind shifter to try and move from the headspace of that time to the headspace of today. But it is not in any way uncommon. White men who left property for their children of color, in other words, their local families, as well as their white families, that's the property most of them left. If it's a big plantation or something, the eldest son, that's what he's going to get. All the rest are getting money, or they're getting enslaved people.
Wow.
That's their investment. That's their inheritance. Okay?
Wow.
It's important to recognize that there is a level of, I don't want to say comfort, but there is a level of acceptance that this is how things are.
Yeah. Boy, that's a big one to get my head around. Well, I was wondering if she was a woman living in this wonderful house in a good area of town and they had a successful merchant business going, why would she want to leave Jamaica in 1853 with her son and his family? It would seem that life would be pretty good where she was.
Well, bear in mind that Jamaica was still a country just on the outskirts of slavery, having for 200 to 300 years a system where the majority of people who were her color were enslaved, were property. Maybe she just wanted to leave a past behind where people would assume that what she was a slave. In addition to that, she's a woman. So those two things add together. Maybe they just needed a fresh start. In the 1850s, Jamaica was also a place where there was a cholera epidemic going on. Maybe that was a scary situation for the family. I don't know why they picked Australia. They must have been brave to go into such an unknown.
Yes.
It seems to me that Susannah was a pretty strong person.
I was hoping to hear that at some stage. That's really good. I mean, that's the way I like to think of her.
Yeah.
But it's wonderful to hear that from somebody who understands what her life would have been like in Jamaica. That's great.
So, Suzanne Francis Brown, it has been amazing having you on the program, and I've so enjoyed hearing all your research, and I'm sure Garry can second that.
This has been absolutely fascinating for me. When I first learned about Susannah, all I was looking at was names and dates and places. But now I'm hearing the stories and I'm getting an image of Susannah and of Moses and their children, and I start to understand her as a real living person whose life has gone through many changes. Thank you for telling the stories. I guess it's the stories that will stick and I'll pass on to my family. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
It's been great getting into this story. It's an amazing story.
Everywhere in the eye can see, we're seeing gravestones. And somewhere around here is Susannah Andrews.
Boy, I'm getting a sense of history just walking past some of these gravestones. Clearly pioneers of Melbourne.
Yes. Now we're on the right track there,
Yeah, we are.
You're following.
We should be in on the left here soon. Here we are.
You found it, Garry.
Wow. Oh, wow.
What does it say?
It says, sacred to the memory of Susan Brandon. I've got pins and needles on my arms. Died 14th of August 1875, aged 82 years. That's a good life, isn't it? 82 in those days. Wow. Her son, George Brydon, died 3rd of April 1896, aged 72 years. His wife, Fanny Florence, died 19th of April 1902, and their son, John, died 24th of May 1932, aged 70 years, loved husband of Jessie.
I mean,
Wow.
I'm getting goosebumps just standing here looking at it as well too, because you can see everything that we've talked about, everything that you've mentioned, everything that you've kind of poured your heart and soul into discovering. In a way, we're kind of seeing it all in one hit, and the collective responsibility of actually witnessing that and letting the world know in a way. I think that's something that you've taken on, and I think that's a really honourable thing for you to have done, you know?
Yes, yeah. Particularly Susan. I mean, wow, what she's come from. You know, I would hope, I know she died in an institution with dementia, but I kind of hope that she died satisfied knowing that she'd set her family up for a good future. Yeah, it's a nice story.